Before we get started, make sure you subscribe to this channel. That way, when I release more videos like this, you'll get notified. So, hey there, and welcome to this week's episode of the Enough Already podcast. I'm your host, Betsy Jordyn, and this is the place where we empower consultants and coaches to forge their own paths to success in their careers and their lives. And I am so excited for today's guests. Today's guest is Dorie Clark, and Dorie Clark is a speaker, author, writer, a Broadway producer, a lyricist, and an author of these amazing books. She's got so many things going on. So excited. Originally, I wanted to have Dorie on the show because she wrote an article on and has a lot of material on networking for introverts. And so there's consultants and coaches out there who need to network and are also introverts. So that's a great topic. But after getting into all kinds of stuff that Dorie has written and talks about in her career, she is a true Renaissance woman. I've never seen anybody who really embodies that Renaissance type of archetype in this world. And she's got that. So there's going to be a lot of things I'm going to want to talk about, goes so far beyond networking for introverts. So without further ado, welcome to the show, Dorie.
Betsy, thank you so much. Glad to be talking with you.
So I have so many things I want to ask you about your books, your career, but I want to go back to the origins, like before you started your consulting business and your coaching practice and became a speaker. You've had a lot of different types of experiences. So can we talk a little bit about your background and how you came to where you are right now?
Yeah, absolutely. So I started my consulting business in 2006, but before that, so it's been a while, but before that, I did a lot of things for, very rapidly for short periods of time, mostly because they weren't working out for me. So in no particular order, I was a nonprofit executive director of a bicycling advocacy organization. I was a spokesperson on a presidential campaign and a governor's race. I was a newspaper reporter. Those were the big ones. I also attempted to get a doctorate in English literature, but I was not accepted into any of the programs that I applied to. So that's the quick précis prior to starting my business 17 years ago.
Did I read something, though, that you were also looking at a theology degree as well, or you have a theology degree from Harvard? Is that accurate?
I did. Yes, that is a thing that I did. So after I got my undergraduate degree in philosophy, and then I immediately went straight in and got a master's of theological studies at Harvard Divinity School.
That is so interesting. So what made you get that degree? By the way, I also spent a couple of years in seminary, and I love that whole perspective, that philosophy, and it really shapes a lot of thinking. What made you choose all of these different types of paths? So you went from philosophy, divinity, spokesperson for a campaign. Like, have you always been this type of person who had all of these varied interests and you just kept following them? Or was there an original goal that you had at the beginning that the philosophy and the theology degree were in congruence with that?
Well, I thought I would probably have a career in academia. So I was just marching along that path. I wanted to have a job where I could read and write and think deep thoughts. And that was the logical place for it. But as it happened, I was sort of swirling around the humanities, and I ultimately decided English literature would be a good place for me because I could bring in philosophy, I could bring in religion to it. But it was a place where I was not wanted. So I had to recalibrate, and I ended up getting a job as a journalist instead. After I had gotten turned down by the doctoral programs, I was sort of scrambling and did some internships, and ultimately was able to get hired as a political reporter at a alternative news weekly in Boston. And I did that for about a year, but unfortunately, it was right around the time the newspaper industry started to collapse. And so I ended up getting laid off about a year into the start of my career.
So you're saying that academia was a place that didn't want you, but aren't you a professor right now at Duke and other places in academia?
Yeah, touche.
Yeah, so like something was missing. It's kind of like Jennifer Hudson being overlooked, at an American Idol and becoming the Oscar winner. It seems like that sort of happened for you.
Yes. Well, one of the things that I find sort of inspiring in life is finding a way to sock it to the people who rejected you. And so something that I did take great pleasure in was within about 3 years of getting turned down for the doctoral programs. I mean, admittedly, these are, slightly different fields, but within academia, I was actually teaching at the college level. I managed to find another way in, which didn't involve having to spend 7 or 8 years getting a doctorate. So I think in many ways it worked out better.
Yeah.
I really wasn't aware that there were a lot of other paths to teaching at the university level besides just getting a doctorate. But it turns out for a lot of things in life, we often imagine that there's one way to do it, but there's usually 10 ways to reach a destination. And so in my case, I was able, even still while I was a journalist, to get access to an opportunity where somebody at the last minute backed out of teaching a class at Tufts University. And I raised my hand. It was a journalism class. And so they're like, hey, is there anybody here who's interested in teaching this? And I'm like, I am. And so I got in touch with them and ended up creating my own curriculum. And so for, close to a decade, I was teaching around Boston in various undergraduate programs. And then a few years after that, I made a concerted effort to shift my focus so that I was teaching in executive education and business school programs, which I now do for Duke and for Columbia University.
So would you say thematically, it sounds like there's a couple of things that kind of run across your career. So even though you have a lot of different interests and a lot of different expressions of those interests, is that there's a couple of things, is that being a deep thinker and being somebody who deeply thinks about ideas and shares those ideas is one part. And then the other belief is that there's 10 different ways to achieve the same outcome. And I don't have to be limited to any one. Would you say like those are running themes throughout your different career expressions, if that's another way to say it?
Yeah. I would say that those are definitely cornerstones for sure. Now, Betsy, we're just getting to know each other, but I'd love to hear more about your journey to starting your consulting practice. Like what were kind of the foundational elements leading up to that?
Oh, I love this. You're turning the tables on me. So my journey into entrepreneurship, I think I've always been an entrepreneur. So you and I are very similar in that way. Like I've always been like one of those kind of people where I've always thought more deeply than the average person. And I got into organization development consulting when I was, I don't know, like 27 or something like that. It's like I was walking around my nonprofit organization and it's like, hey, they're saying this but they're doing this. This doesn't make sense, and I discovered the whole organization development field. So I got into that, built a good career, but then my dad died. I was working at Disney and it was a great job. Perfect career, especially for an internal OD consultant. So I've always been like this creating things from scratch kind of person. But then when my dad died, I'm like, I don't want to work those hours. I had a couple kids, they were really little. And, it was like that existential kind of thing. So I left and I started my own business. But the thing that I had with my business journey is I didn't feel like I started the right business. So that was an easier transition. It was pivoting from doing that into more brand mentoring, which is what I do now, which is where there's a lot of similarities with what you talk about in your books, like around the reinventing you, the entrepreneurial you. Like that's the stuff that I'm really in the standout, the whole idea of like coming up with ideas. That's what I'm passionate about. But it took a lot to get rid of the other stuff. But it seems like you're different, is that I feel like I had to get rid of things, but it feels like you just sort of integrate it and move on.
Well, I maybe I just have trouble letting go, but no, it's true. I do try to keep a foot in different things, but a key part of strategy, which is the focus of my latest book, The Long Game, is really about what to emphasize in a given moment. It's not necessarily that you have to divest yourself entirely of something, although sometimes that is the right answer, but certainly you have to make choices about where you're deploying your energy. And I think that's important for all of us.
Yeah, I think that is an interesting thing about like the energy. It's not just like what you do with your time, but it is about the energy, where you're putting your heart towards something. So maybe it's like, I don't really get rid of the stuff from behind, but it's like being more conscious about like redirecting the energy in a different direction.
Yeah, totally.
So so it sounds like that if I read in some of your materials correctly, your last job was before you started your business was as a nonprofit executive. And what is that? Was that previous job before you left and started your business?
Yeah, that was the direct one beforehand. And in many ways it contributed to my wanting to start my business as a consultant because I realized without knowing it, I never really thought about starting my own business, but about a year into working as a nonprofit executive director, I had this sudden insight that really what I was doing was running a small business. And I mean, it was reinvesting all the profits, but it was basically a small business. And I thought, oh, wait a minute. I'm learning all this stuff. I could apply this to myself. This basically training wheels here for me. And so I decided at that point that I would take another year. So I ended up running the nonprofit for 2 years, but I would use that time to really be deliberate about thinking through how I could launch my own practice, which I did the following year.
So it sounds like then you started off as a philosophy and then a theology student, and then you were looking at academia. That didn't work. You got into journalism and you were doing that job for a while, running and then being a spokesperson for a campaign, which seems like that's what led to the nonprofit. And then the nonprofit is where you realize like, hey, I'm actually running, a small business by leading this. And that's what got you to make the leap into starting your business. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's a pretty good recitation right there. Absolutely.
So then what was your first business? So you took those couple years, what did you decide was your initial first business?
So I've really since starting working for myself. I mean, I've technically only had one business. It's called Clark Strategic Communications, but on the bright side, that's a very vague name, so it can mean a lot of things.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So my original conception was that I would do political consulting because that was a world that I knew, was a world I came out of. But almost by chance, I was not getting a lot of political clients initially, but I was getting a lot of nonprofit clients and government clients. And I thought, oh, well, that's interesting. I guess I'll go where the interest is. And so I began shifting into doing that kind of communications consulting. Again, originally I was just starting with things I knew how to do. So I was doing a lot of PR. But over time, I began to shift into various other aspects of marketing. Social media was kind of just beginning to be a thing. So I would consult a little bit on social media and then more upstream marketing activities. So my focus area of the consulting did change over time.
So were you doing mostly like individual clients, like working with nonprofit organizations, or you were mentoring people? Like what was the structure of your business at that time?
Yeah, I was, I ultimately started later doing individual executive coaching and things like that. But in the earliest days of my business, it was all enterprise level consulting for organizations.
So you've made a significant leap from doing, just having a consulting business to becoming the thought leader that you are. Like, what was it that gave you that shift to become that speaker, that author? How did you make that shift?
Well, thank you, Betsy. I appreciate it. Ultimately, the kind of thought leadership work that I've worked to create came out of the impetus that just about every consultant has, which is, oh, I need to get more business. So ultimately, I was trying to think of ways to market myself. And I had a little bit of what I considered to be a disadvantage, which is that a lot of folks who were starting businesses were starting them later than I was. Maybe they had this whole career. They knew lots of people in corporate. I didn't know anybody in corporate. I knew no one because I had worked at a newspaper and I'd worked on political campaigns. So I didn't have very good connections. And so I realized that I needed to do something to get better connections. And networking could get you part of the way there, but I wasn't that interesting yet. So what I really needed to do was find a way to become interesting. And I realized that content creation and writing for high profile publications was the way to do that. So I doubled down because people are willing to talk to you if you're interviewing them for a brand name publication. And you're also more interesting for people to meet in general if you write for a brand name publication. So I thought, okay, this is great. So I worked really aggressively to cultivate that piece of my business. And so initially for Huffington Post, back in the day when that was a big thing, and then for Forbes, and then for Harvard Business Review, I was writing articles and really kind of went nuclear on that for a few years to build up a head of steam in terms of my online presence.
So somebody might be listening and saying, okay, well, you're interesting because you've done all of this interesting kind of things, theology degree, the political stuff. You're interesting itself. Somebody else might be saying, well, what about me? Like, I'm not interesting. I'm not interesting like you, or I don't have the journalism background, so I can't write like you. Would you say that was unique things that you had as your advantage, or that you felt like you were interesting, or that others experienced that and you had writing skills? Or is that just something like, it's just a mindset that you cultivated or a skill set that you could develop?
Well, I think that, everybody has their own unique set of advantages, right? I mean, we were talking earlier about the fact that, I was bummed out that I didn't have all of these great corporate connections because, in my mind's eye, like the archetypal consultant is like some 55-year-old guy that's like, oh, I'll just call up my friends from the past 30 years at BCG. And, oh, okay, well, that was easy. So I did not have that. But, I did have other things, which, some people might look at it, yeah, but you were a journalist, you know how to write. I mean, it's like, oh, okay, yeah, that and $10 will get you a pack of gum. Like, all right, yeah, I figured out something to do with it, but it was not ready-made that would lead to clients. But we all have some kind of structural advantage in terms of who we know or what we can do or what our skills are, what our perspective is, or what have you. And it's just a question of harnessing that and being thoughtful about, all right, what is it that you can do? What is it that you can bring that is the asset that you can leverage? So yeah, I was leveraging writing because I didn't have connections to leverage.
So that seems to be a lot about what you talked about in the Reinventing You book, is all around like, how do you figure out like what is your competitive advantage that could be, you might be perceiving it as a disadvantage, but is an advantage. And that's something that you could repackage and turn it into your next career. Is that accurate of what I heard in that book? Or is there other things that you share in that book that I'm missing that relates to this point?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's right on. And in fact, in my latest book, The Long Game, I have a section where I talk about essentially the sort of the fungibility of assets. And what I mean by that is that you can trade what you have for what you want. And so I created an online course and community called Recognized Expert. And one of the pillars that we teach people is that fundamentally, when it comes to becoming a recognized expert, there's 3 key points that you have to have. There's content creation so that you can share your ideas and other people know what they are. There's social proof so that other people know that you're credible. And then there's your network so that more people know about you, basically. And you have to have all those pieces fit together. But most people coming into it don't have all of them. And so the question is, well, how do you make trades? And so, for instance, if you have a really good network, but you don't have good social proof, meaning like sort of public credit, evidence of your credibility. All right, how can you use your network to get social proof? So let's say, oh, you know everybody. Well, great. Do you know a professor at a business school where you could, get him to invite you to guest lecture? And then all of a sudden, good. Well, she's been a guest lecturer at, prominent university. That's helpful. But maybe it's different. Maybe you have social proof, but you don't have any content, something like that. Well, okay, if you have social proof, you have some kind of affiliation, or you're an award winner or something like that, you can often leverage that to be able to create content, because having enough social proof, people will look good introducing you. It's like, oh, well, gosh, my friend, the MacArthur Award winner, would like to write a blog. Can I introduce you to the editor? The answer is like, yes, you're going to look good that a MacArthur Award winner. So yes, that introduction will work. Now, I'm deliberately using extreme examples. Most of us are not homies with too many MacArthur Award winners, but in our company, in our field, in our industry, there's sort of local variations of these things. And we just need to think, how do I trade what I have for what I need?
So it sounds like then when you were at a certain point where, okay, my business is going, I'm going to start it. I think I'm going to do political consulting because that's your background, but nonprofits came to you. That's good. But in order for you to take your business to the next level, to get some additional clients, it's like, wow, I have to kind of like move into this recognized expert status. Like you kind of had that vision. So I got to be interesting. I got to start writing content. I need to get the social proof. And then that sort of became the pillars of that long-term strategy that you had is I can make that step change.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Now I'm curious for you, Betsy, how did you sort of establish credibility early on when you went solo?
Well, I had it easy because I had Disney as a background. So when I left Disney, like that part was the easier part, was just like, okay, I can get clients right away because I had the Disney cachet. But I would say that really what made the difference for my business was I think you and I both know Chad Barr, who was my first web guy. And I remember when I was working on my first website, my first real website, and he's like, you're going to write content. I'm like, okay, like I could write articles and, because I could, content comes easy to me. I love content. It's super fun. And then, but then he's kept pushing me for more and more because I could do one. He's like, well, then I want a whole bunch more. I'm like, okay. And I didn't think it was like anything special that I would do all of this content. And then he's like, oh, and then you're going to do videos. I'm like, I'm not going to do videos. And he's like, yes, you're going to do videos. I'm like, okay, fine. So I went to Cleveland to do videos. And he's like, okay, you need to write your scripts ahead of time. I'm like, no, I'm not going to do scripts ahead of time. That's not me. And he's like, yes, you are. And so he made me write scripts. And then I did my scripts and I recorded them with him. And he's like, this is terrible. You're going to go back and fix them. And then I fixed them.
Wait, a taskmaster, this Chad Barr.
I know. But then I recorded it and I had like 7 videos for my first website. And I had like 20 articles. And all of a sudden I started getting, so then when my website launched, I didn't realize like that it was like the power of SEO and other things that were drawing clients. I just thought I put good juju out there. And it's like, oh, the magical client fairy is just like bringing clients to me. This is great. But it took me years to realize that, that content, is such a great way to attract clients and warm clients up. And it was really weird because I remember going to, some of these clients that like I was working with AAA and I never met them before. And I got there and they treated me like I'm treating you like I'm a fangirl. I'm so excited. They treated me like I'm something special. And apparently a couple of the junior members of this HR team found my articles and they quoted me in their grad school, papers and stuff like that. I'm like, wow, content, man. Now, the thing that I need to do next, like my step change, is I need to work on the publications. And getting in those larger publications, really trying to take the stage. Like I haven't done that. Like I'm that introvert. And I get intimidated from that standpoint. So apparently you've overcome the introversion challenge to get in front of those audiences. Any tips on that one? Because I would love to hear them for myself.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in terms of writing for high profile publications, there's really just like two prongs, two battles they have to face. The first one, of course, is writing the kind of piece that they would want. And the second piece is, well, okay, once you have that, how do you get it in front of them and how do you get noticed? So I can tell you very methodically, with regard to the second piece about how do you break in. I was doing this at a time when I did not have a lot of contacts or colleagues. I had some, and so I was able to break into the Huffington Post because I knew some people who blogged for them, and I just there were about half a dozen, and so I had to keep asking different people because some people they're like, oh, I don't know my editor well enough, or oh, it's a bad time, or whatever. But eventually, through 6 people, I managed to find one that was willing and able to introduce me to the editor, and I was able to get in. So that was great. But I realized that I needed to write for more places. The Huffington Post was good, but what it was really known for was politics. It wasn't really like a business site exactly. So I wanted to get into something more businessy. So I actually devoted several days to this, several full business days. This was like a decade ago. And the specifics will be different for people now, but I think the principles are fairly useful. I mean, obviously, if you have a friend who writes for a publication, great, ask them. But I'm talking to people who may not, right? If you're coming in cold, what I did was I made a spreadsheet of like 24 different publications that I thought could potentially be good to write for. And of course, you have your A and B and C list, but it's everything from, sort of prominent business publications to daily newspapers to, the blogs of television networks or foreign papers that are read in the US, like all these kind of different variations. I thought as broadly as I could. And then I just went through them systematically and I was looking through and I said, all right, well, do they have a blog that has articles on it? Okay, yes. Do they have outside contributors? Is everything written by a staff member of theirs? In which case that's not helpful. Or do they actually publish things by outside voices sometimes? Okay, great. If they do, then who's the editor? And that's not always easy to find out. You have to kind of search around. So I would go on LinkedIn, I'd search on the sitemap of the website to try to see if it could direct me to like a masthead. That's sort of an archaic term from the old days, but it's basically saying, it's like a listing of the staff and who does what. You kind of have to guess, right? Sometimes it's like, articles editor or online editor or digital editor or blog editor. I mean, they all have different names. But you just kind of take a guess, and then you have to figure out the person's web, email address, which sometimes they list and sometimes they don't. And if they don't list it, you have to hunt more on the internet to try to see if you can figure out what the pattern is for their particular publication. So all this, I ended up creating this big spreadsheet, and then I just sent cold pitches, and in the cold pitch that I sent, I basically gave all my credentials, like a little paragraph about here's me, here's my bio, here's my why I'm credible. Here's what I'd like to do for you. And, would you be interested in this? And I wrote to about 24 publications. And, it's a little disheartening, right? I was a former professional journalist willing to write for free. And out of about 24, give or take, publications, I had 3 get back to me with any kind of a response. But, 3 sort of expressing an interest. And so 2 of them were like, well, send us some ideas. And so anyway, I like killed myself to get pitches together. And then 2 of them immediately dropped off the face of the earth and never responded to me or any of my follow-ups. So I'm like, oh, great. Okay. But one of them, which turned out to be Forbes, was in a mode. And like, so you just have to recognize so much of this is like luck, right? Forbes was in a mode where they had just decided to do an expansion of their contributor network. And they're like, great, can you have something by next week? Like, everybody else was dissing me and they were like maniacal and wanted something immediately. Like that's the polarity. So I'm like, okay. So I started writing for them and I wrote for them for about 2.5 years.
Okay, so I think I'm going to add a third pillar to what might be thematic throughout your career. So thing 1 is being a deep thinker and relating to ideas. 2 is that there could be more than 10, there's 10 different ways to a goal. And it seems like the best way to a goal and the best way to overcome any mindset issues or challenges is to break that goal down into very, very strategic steps. To be like planning, like just instead of like, oh my gosh, I don't know how to work for, write for a publication. It's like, all right, well, let's take a step back, look at the publications, analyze them, go to the next step, and then just look at what the opportunities are. But it seems like there's a huge strategic component to what you do, where it's like, I have a vision. And maybe like strategies, your coping strategy, where it's like anything that makes you anxious, it's like, well, I'll put a strategy against it. Now I'm not going to be anxious about it because I could accomplish it if I could break it down. Am I hearing anything accurate in that? You could correct me if I'm wrong.
I love it, Betsy. No, I think that's great. I think that's right on. It's true. I mean, a lot of times people do get kind of paralyzed. Oh, I don't know how to do that. But I mean, like, whatever, there's so few things in life, except for like super boring things that everybody has figured out and that everybody already knows how to do. I mean, most of the interesting things are things that people don't quite know how to do. So you just have to kind of man up and figure it out, like, okay, try something, whatever. I mean, it may not work, but people, I think, really dramatically overstate the effects of failure. I mean, it's whatever. Like if a high profile publication rejected me, I'm not like going to lose my house. I'm not,
right?
It's not
just
like
a little bruised ego. It's not like the world is going to end.
Yeah. I mean, like, okay, I wasted a couple of days of my life trying to do pitches and, they dissed me. Okay. It's really not the end of the world. I think, we just always have to contextualize the stakes. And in most cases, the stakes are fairly low. So, why not? Okay.
And I feel like that's a lot that's, this goes to this book, like playing that long game of saying, well, if I really want to write for these publications, that I just need to stick with it and not expect like, okay, well, I'm going to make a decision, send out a pitch. Everyone's gonna be like, yay. And then you get it right away. And I think that there's that expectation a lot of us have is like, we're going to be this overnight success rather than I got to do consistent action over time. And then also I'm an overnight success with all of this consistent action.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, something that certainly is very explicitly one of my mantras is everything takes longer than we want it to. I mean, it would be so nice if, there was just this sort of steady march toward what we want. But, there's gyrations that we have to deal with. And sometimes it might be a straight line, but it's just a super delayed one, and other people's timeline is not necessarily your timeline. So it's frustrating, but if we want to get the result, then we need to understand that.
It seems like you're very patient, like you're very clear. And then it's like you put unique strategies in place for you. Like I love what you talk about with your networking parties. I thought that was just brilliant. And I think, was it in this book? I can't remember because I've read so many of your books. Like, which book is it? It is also in this book where you talk about like the dinner parties and how you use that. Like, can you talk about like your methodical approach towards networking, as an introvert and leveraging your strengths as an introvert?
Yeah, absolutely. So this became
is it in this book or where did I read it?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that it is. I have a chapter in the long game called "The Right People, the Right Room," and it's a sort of deep dive into networking. But it really came to the fore for me back 7 or 8 years ago when I moved to New York. I'm now facing it again because I've moved to Miami. But when I moved to New York, I recognized, and it kind of hit me once I was there. Like I hadn't sort of planned for this. I knew a lot of people in kind of an objective sense, but I wasn't really friends with them exactly. It was more just like, okay, I have a bunch of acquaintances. And so the way that I felt was like, okay, if I needed somebody to have like a networking coffee with, then I could do that. But I didn't have friends that I could like go see a movie with on Saturday night. And I'm like, all right, well that, I got to have some of that too. Otherwise this is going to be pretty lonely. So I embarked on a strategy of basically just trying to meet people and make friends. And the good news is that, if you're doing it right, I'm a believer that they can and should be the same thing. So I realized that it would not go well if I just sort of sat back and waited for other people to invite me to things. The truth is when you're first in a city, people just don't remember. Like it takes a lot of exposure for them to think of you as being in a place. And so I was never going to, even for people I knew relatively well, I was never going to be top of mind. Like, oh, let's call Dorie, because they still thought of me as living in a different state. So I needed to do something to disrupt that. So I just started having these gatherings. I started having my own because I'm like, all right, I've got to make it happen. So often, twice a month, I would say probably on average, sometimes even more than that, I would host dinners and sometimes I'd co-host them with friends so I could meet new people and cross-pollinate. But I was hosting these dinners of about 8 or 10 people. And it was actually really great because it was, the thing that I hate is the kind of mass undifferentiated, like, let's go to a networking event. And like,
yep.
Half the time people aren't even wearing name tags. You don't know who they are. You're coming up to them. You have literally no contextual clues. You're trying to come up with a conversation from scratch. It's like so painful. Whereas if you have a curated dinner gathering, I was able to set it up the way that I wanted, which made it, as an introvert, which I think hopefully made it nice for other people that were introverts. So it was a smaller group. It was a managed conversation. I sent bios in advance so that people knew who was there and they could be like, oh yeah, I want to ask him about such and such. And they could kind of plan it out. And it was orderly. Like as people streamed in, like once everyone had arrived, I went around, I made everybody do introductions so that, even if you look it up the night before, you can't quite remember which one is which. So you need to have it reinforced. You need to have a structure so that people can have a good time. Often hosts, there's multiple problems here, right? One is that many people don't feel empowered to be a host because they feel like, oh, that's somebody else. That's not me. And it's like, oh, really? Well, why? Why can't you do that? Like, I think anyone can be a host. And secondly, a lot of hosts even don't.
And it doesn't mean you have to cook either, right?
Oh yeah, for sure.
You could order out. Okay, go on. Sorry. Because that's where some people God. I could host, but I'm not going to cook. Like, I'm not a good cook. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm such a big fan. Like, I'll have people over for dinner and I'll be like, great. And we're ordering Thai. Tell me what you want. But often I do it at dinners. These days, everybody has so many dietary restrictions. And I'm including myself in this. I'm vegetarian, but whatever dietary restriction somebody has that's not yours, you're like, God, they're so annoying, So like, yeah. I once at a 6-person dinner party and there were 3 different menus that I had to have because, this one can't have this and that, there was one guy I invited to the party and last minute he's like, oh, I'm bringing a friend. I'm like, oh, great. You're bringing a friend to an intimate dinner party at my house and you're telling me an hour before. Great. And he's like, oh, no. She's gluten-free.
Gluten-free. I do it.
It was a spaghetti party. I'm like, are you insane? So anyway, but yeah, you could do it at a restaurant, but the hosts don't feel empowered enough to really take control of it. But if you don't, no one else is going to. Like, a guest isn't going to interrupt the person who's going on way too long. The host needs to do it because the host's responsibility is to make sure that everybody collectively has a good time. And that means you kind of need to enforce things sometimes, but it makes for a great event when you do that.
I love that idea too, because it's like if you're doing like outside of the last minute gluten-free thing, because that is very stressful. As a vegetarian, I'm a vegetarian too. It's like everybody should have like some sort of meat-free, option of some kind. But the idea of being able to have a curated group and then like have other people like introduce you to other people, I think that that's such a great opportunity rather than going to a networking event where you have to like have your, your business card and what I do. Like, I went to a networking event the other day and it's like, I don't remember anybody. Like, it was like, that was fun for a minute, but everything was so different. Like, all the businesses were so different. You have to like stretch to find the synergies. And if a curated group, you can create the synergies or you can figure out what it is on the front end. And
totally,
I'm sure you got all the invitations that you needed to go do the fun things in New York afterwards.
Yeah, once people remember that you're there, and also, frankly, once they see you in a context where it's like, oh, Dorie's fun, she organizes fun things, like I want to be a part of it, then it kind of motivates them to want to include you just in the sort of reciprocal, the reciprocal cycle. So yeah, I actually pre-pandemic, the pandemic kind of disrupted everything. But pre-pandemic, I had built this killer social life in New York. It was really great.
So I'm going to want to go into the selfish part of this interview because I'm going to have to ask you about your Broadway experience. So before I go into the selfish part, because I know that I'm not sure all my listeners are going to want to hear that, but I do. So I'm going to, it's my podcast. I can talk about that. I just want to get a summary of your books because it seems to me that there's an order to your books that seems to be a logical order of somebody sort of like having a job and then reinventing themselves and then standing out, and then, leading to this last book around, the long game. Am I reading into that, or is it on purpose that you have like reinventing you to the standout, to the entrepreneurial you, to the long game?
Yeah, no, you're exactly right, Betsy. I have thought of it as sort of sequential in many ways in terms of the arc of a person's career, or certainly the arc of things that I was personally interested in. So yeah, that's exactly right.
So can you give like a quick synopsis of the books and share a little bit about like where this latest book fits in and what's the next book? I'm sure you got a next book, right? I can't imagine you not having another book, but.
Well, so the first book that I wrote was Reinventing You, which as the name implies, is about how to reinvent yourself professionally if you want to change jobs or change careers, or, in a sort of narrower application, it could even just be changing how other people view you, but, some kind of transformation and how to manage that successfully. And then, to your point, once you've accomplished that, once you've kind of reinvented yourself into the place you want to go, it's like, all right, well, great. How do I actually get some traction here? How do I get known? And so Stand Out is a book about how to become a thought leader, or how to become a recognized expert inside your company or in your field, and the strategies that you need to know around building a following around your ideas. Then I shifted to the question that was, it was of keen interest to me, which is, okay, great. If you're known for your ideas, that is wonderful. How do you actually monetize that?
Mm-hmm,
and so Entrepreneurial You is basically a book about how to make money in lots of different ways. So if you are an employee at a regular company, regular day job, it's about a variety of different side hustles that you can incorporate to grow your brand and earn revenue. If you're an entrepreneur like I am, it's about ways that you can kind of strategically expand your business to create multiple revenue streams. And, I'm proud of it. In the first year, you write books because you want to learn things. And in the first year after writing and publishing Entrepreneurial You, I applied, I took my own medicine, right? And I applied the strategies that I had learned from basically getting this carte blanche to interview a bunch of people about, hey, how do you make money? What does that process look like? And I added nearly $200,000 to my top line revenue as a result of employing those strategies, which was, very helpful. So, especially because I don't have employees besides myself. So that, for me was very empowering that the strategies worked in that way. And then finally, The Long Game is a book about how to really think about your career, your professional life in the kind of overall arc of how it fits into who you are and want to be. It's about how do you take a strategic and holistic view of your career.
And I like the whole idea too of like strategic thinking really begins with like giving yourself the time. Like you can't be strategic thinking if you don't have time for strategic thinking. And it seems like that's the number one, is that we're in this mode where it's like, okay, I got to be busy, busy, busy. Rather it's like, all right, let's take a beat and like, let me think. Like matching the reflection with action seems to be a lot of what The Long Game is about, is reflect, act, taking that, have that rhythms going on.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so true. I mean, so many of us are almost pathologically busy. And so, it's not that strategic thinking takes so much time. It's not like, oh yeah, you need another 20 hours a week for strategic thinking. I mean, if that was the case, nobody would ever do it because nobody ever could. It's really more of a mindset than anything. But it is equally true that you can't do strategic thinking if you literally have no time, if you have not a moment to breathe and not a moment to eat or use the bathroom. You're never going to be strategic under those conditions. So you have to find a way to create just a little bit of margin for yourself.
And creating those like rhythms at the same time. Like if you're like, for me, it's like some of the rhythms that I recognize I do better at is if I take like at least 30 minutes a day at the beginning of my day to read, to journal, to think, and then I can get in my day rather than like, okay, I got to rush to get in my day, and it's like, if I'm trying to launch something bigger, then I need that much more time. It seems like you have to, like what I try to work on is like based on what the outcome is, I have to have that much of the processing time based on it. Like if you're going to create a signature course, you need time, the same amount of time or double or whatever the time of how big the course is, you're going to have to do that. I want to hit on one thing that you said, and then I want to ask you about the Broadway stuff. I love what you said about the writing. You said it really fast about writing is because I want to learn something. Because that's like that for me as a content creator. I know that I'm in a zone when I'm like writing something and it's like, oh, that was interesting. I never thought about that before. Like, that's really interesting. Like, that's where it's like, I feel like I'm in the zone because I don't feel like I'm writing. I feel like I'm scribing. Like, is that what you mean by that? Or is it like, I just am being intentional in my development. So I'm going to write this and then research it. Like what did you mean by that?
Well, what I meant really was that I had a bit of a professional development curriculum for myself. There were problems that I wanted to solve in my business. And in particular, Stand Out and Entrepreneurial You were written because I wanted to solve those problems. So Stand Out was written because I wanted to get recognized for my ideas. How do I become a recognized expert? And I didn't know. And so I used the book as a forcing function for me to interview people that I wanted to talk to and really think deeply and be able to create a methodology that I could follow. And then hopefully in the book, show other people how they could follow it. And it was very similar for Entrepreneurial You about, all right, I was making decent money, but I wanted to make really great money. And I saw some people out there who were doing it. And I'm like, gosh, I'd really like to ask them about that. I'd really like to see what they're doing. But you don't want to be the annoying person that's always like, can I pick your brain? And, after a while, you just want to smack them. So you need to come in with something a little better than that and add some value. And saying, hey, I'm writing a book. Can I interview you for my book about this? Is a much better ask. And it enabled me to have access to a lot of people who were doing interesting, successful things. And I was able to learn from them. And again, use the book as the fulcrum to transmit that to other people.
So that's why you have so many specific examples of people in your books. Because but that's one of the common ways that you write is you have tons of very practical, personal case studies, examples of everything. So it's the interviews that got you there.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so now you do have multiple income streams. So you've got the books, you've got your speaking, you've got your mastermind groups, you've got your consulting and a bunch of other things. And then the latest project that I want to talk to you about is how in the world did you get into Broadway? And what are you doing with Broadway? And can I see your stuff? And tell me more.
Yeah, thank you. I love that. So yeah, one of the things that I actually mention a little bit in the long game is that 2015, that was the year that my book Stand Out came out. I was traveling so much. I was really kind of working myself to the bone, giving a million talks to try to promote the book. And sure enough, as we roll into the new year of 2016, I have just finished traveling. I have this terrible cold. I'm just sort of sitting there over Christmas being, sad and miserable and like, why am I working myself this hard? And so I embarked upon a campaign of what I called one uniquely New York activity per week. And so what I meant by that was that if I'm living in New York, if I'm paying all the money to live in New York, I might as well take advantage of it. And so I decided that every week I would make a point. I would have a requirement for myself where I would do one uniquely New York activity. And it was all kinds of things, but it had to be something that you really could only do in New York. So, like a really special restaurant or a neighborhood tour or a tourist attraction or something. And one example would be going to see Broadway shows. And so I went with a friend, January of 2016, to see Fun Home, which that year was the Tony winner on Broadway. And it was really great. It was very, impactful for me. And I woke up the next morning gripped with a certainty that what I really needed to do was to learn to write musical theater. And so the short version
that's the logical place from a theology philosophy student and a professor. Like that makes perfect sense. Go on.
100%. So anyway, that's what I've been working on since then. So I've worked hard. I've written a complete musical. I have 2 other musicals that I'm writing that are in process. I have, been accepted to and completed a kind of prestigious musical theater training program, all the different things. And so my collaborator and I are just working to get the show, which is called Absolute Zero, advanced. And so just a couple of weeks ago, as we're having this conversation, we had 2 nights of a staged reading in New York City, sponsored by the York Theater, which is an off-Broadway theater company with professional actors, which was great. And we're just working to move it forward.
So are you the lyricist, or do you write are you everything, like everything in the written part, and then your partner's the musical side, or like, what is it that you're writing?
Yeah, so I do all the words. So I'm the lyricist and the book writer or the script writer, and she is the composer.
Wow. So what's the vibe of your show? Is it like a Hamilton-esque kind of thing, or like what would we compare it to?
So the sort of quick tagline or sort of short description for it is I like to call it a sexy lesbian spy thriller musical. So,
of course, that's great. Oh my god.
Yeah. So it's kind of a little bit Catch Me If You Can. It's a little bit chess, sort of, and it's lighthearted. I mean, we really try to pay homage to James Bond movies. I mean, it's not a parody. It is intended as a sort of modern updating with interesting three-dimensional female characters. But we do have the kind of, brassy overtones of 60s Bond. And we do have some jokes and some Easter eggs in it that will appeal to Bond aficionados.
Oh my gosh, that sounds amazing. What was it like for you to see all of the ideas that you had in your head and the words that you were trying to express, seeing actors bring them to life? Like, what was it like the first time you saw it?
Yeah, I mean, it's just the best. It's really terrific to be able to see something and make it manifest, and especially have it in the hands of people who are really legitimately good and make it sound good. Frankly, make it sound better than me in the shower. So it's really magical.
So do you see yourself writing another book after all your other books from the business side, or do you see that the Broadway thing is moving you into the next iteration of Dorie Clark? Strategic communications.
Yes. I mean, I'm sure I will write another book, but part of my decision-making process, part of my strategy around the long game is that I decided that, I think that in my past books, I actually moved on too quickly from them, and I didn't give them enough time to kind of percolate in the marketplace. And so for the long game, I decided that in order to give it the best shot possible of getting the continued sustained exposure that it needs, that I would work on promoting it for 5 years. So I'm really making it my primary focus, so I'm intending to go very meta and play the long game for the long game.
And I think that makes sense because especially after the pandemic and where people are at right now, really taking that time to think about the long game again and reinvent yourself, it just seems like extremely timely. So that makes sense. And giving yourself that time. And in the meantime, so how many, you have this musical, once this one, so is it in the test and then is it going to go out on the road somewhere and then come back to Broadway? Like, what's the plan for your musical?
Oh my goodness. Well, the thing about musicals and going to Broadway, I mean, this is not an easy path, right? On average, it takes about 7 years from a show initially being started to reaching Broadway. If it reaches Broadway, we're very committed and we want to do that. But there's a lot of hurdles in terms of getting the interest of a regional theaters, let's say, producers, ultimately even getting it to a Broadway theater. There's 41 Broadway theaters. That's it. It's a very fixed marketplace. And so you have to have a show that the owners of the three primary theater companies, or there's a handful of nonprofits that have Broadway theaters. But you've got to have something that is funded, ready to go, and that the theater owner says, yeah, that could work. So there's a lot of pieces that need to fit together, but for where we are in the process, we feel very good. We feel like it's been making excellent progress up to this point. So we're just, continuing to move the ball forward.
I'm so excited. I mean, as soon as it comes out, I definitely want to participate. This is amazing. Okay, just a sidebar question. What's your number one favorite Broadway show? Just for my own curiosity.
Oh, well, the classic all time would be Rent. What's yours, Betsy?
That's a good question because I go back and forth. I've probably seen Les Mis one too many times, so I've always loved Les Mis, but it's like, there's only so many times that you see it. But right now I'm obsessed with Hamilton. I love the creativity of Hamilton. I was a history major, so the idea of like reinventing history through the musical, I thought was really cool.
Yeah, it is brilliant.
So we talked about so many different things today. And I know that I could talk to you forever, but we got to be sensitive to the time. Is there anything else that you want to tell me about forging your own path to your own career, taking charge of your career, playing that long game? And I'm just not asking you the right question.
I think you're asking all the right questions, Betsy. This is fantastic. But I will just mention for anyone who wants to go deeper that I do have a free resource, which is the Long Game Strategic Thinking Self-Assessment to help you think sort of walk you through the process of thinking more strategically about your own life and career. And folks who are interested can get it for free at dorieclark.com/thelonggame.
And do you have like a YouTube channel, or do you have other places that people can find out more about you? Or all of it is linked through your website?
I mean, there's all the channels, except TikTok. I haven't really gotten on that, but just about all the other channels besides that. But yes, the main hub is my website, dorieclark.com.
Cool. And then I had one other question for you and I just lost it. Oh, I didn't ask you about your TED Talks. And I know that that's a big part of what you do as well. So would people be able to find your TED Talks also on YouTube? That's where I was going with the YouTube thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Probably the easiest thing. I have done a number of TEDx talks. I've done 4 of them. My most recent one, which is called The Real Reason You're So Busy and What to Do About It. I feel fortunate. It's kind of caught on. It's been seen more than 2 million times, and folks can check that out if they're interested at dorieclark.com/TED. But to see any or all of them, you can go to the website, dorieclark.com.
Amazing. I cannot thank you enough for being on the show. I'm humbled. I'm so grateful for the conversation. And for those of you who are listening, thank you so much for participating. Definitely check out Dorie's information and all the amazing things that she's doing. And until next time, thanks for listening.